Chapter I. The Gentleman in the Grey Gloves. In recording the singular adventures which I shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes during the latter years of the 1880s, I have often been troubled by the difficulty of selecting from among so many curious affairs those which deserve preservation. Some possessed the grotesque charm of the bizarre, others the cold fascination of scientific ingenuity, while a few were so terrible in their implications that even now I hesitate to commit them to paper. Yet there remains one case, strange above all for the peculiar duality of the man at its centre, which has lingered in my thoughts long after more violent tragedies had faded. I allude to the affair which Holmes himself once referred to as the most accomplished performance of human deception that ever sought to outwit me. The public never learned the true particulars. Even Inspector Lestrade, who believed himself fully informed, understood only the surface of the matter. Indeed, had Holmes not entrusted me with certain private documents before his retirement to Sussex, I should never have comprehended the full extent of the peril through which we passed in the autumn of 1889. It began upon a wet and bitter evening in October. A dense yellow fog had descended upon London, muffling the streets and turning the lamps of Baker Street into blurred halos trembling in the gloom. The air carried that mingled odour of rain-soaked horsehair, coal smoke, and damp pavement which every Londoner knows too well. Holmes lounged in his armchair beside the fire, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while his keen grey eyes remained fixed upon the ceiling in profound abstraction. The untidy litter upon the table testified to one of his chemical pursuits. Retorts, stained papers, and a spirit lamp occupied nearly every available surface. A violin lay upon the sofa amid scattered newspapers, while the Persian slipper, in which Holmes kept his tobacco, hung from the mantelpiece. As for myself, I had been attempting, with little success, to read a monograph concerning tropical fevers recently sent to me by an old colleague from Bart's. Holmes's silence had persisted for nearly an hour. At last he spoke. "You observe, Watson, that our visitor is a military man." I glanced up irritably. "My dear Holmes, we have no visitor. Not yet, but one ascends the stair at this moment." Sure enough, from below came the measured tread of footsteps upon the 17 steps leading to our rooms. "You astonish me," said I. "How could you possibly know anything regarding him before he enters?" Holmes smiled faintly, without shifting his gaze. "The cadence, my dear fellow. Civilians hesitate upon Mrs. Hudson's third stair because it sags at the centre. Soldiers do not. Habitual discipline teaches them consistency of stride. Furthermore, the right heel strikes more heavily than the left, evidence of an old injury, likely sustained while carrying weight. One also detects the faint clink of metal. Spurs are unlikely in London weather, therefore a military cane. Finally, he pauses now before our door, indicating uncertainty. An officer reduced in circumstances. A moment later Mrs. Hudson admitted precisely such a gentleman. He was tall and spare, perhaps 50 years of age, with a dark military moustache streaked heavily with iron grey. His clothing had once been of excellent quality, but showed unmistakable signs of wear. Rain glistened upon the shoulders of his coat, and he carried a heavy ebony cane with a silver wolf's head handle. But it was not his attire that arrested my attention. It was his face. The left side possessed the firm dignity of a distinguished officer, calm blue eye, strong cheekbone, and disciplined expression. The right side, however, seemed curiously altered. Not disfigured precisely, but subtly different, as though belonging to another man altogether. The eyebrow dipped lower, the corner of the mouth twitched intermittently. Most singular of all, the right eye conveyed a furtive nervousness, wholly absent from the left. The effect was profoundly disturbing. Holmes motioned him toward the chair opposite the fire. "Pray be seated, Colonel." The man started visibly. "You know me? I know that you held rank sufficient to command respect, that you served in India, and that you have lately undergone severe mental strain. The remainder, I fancy, you will communicate yourself." The stranger gave a weary laugh. Your reputation has not exaggerated your talents, Mr. Holmes. I am Colonel Alistair Beaumont, formerly of the 32nd Bombay Infantry. Holmes inclined his head lazily. And now, the Colonel hesitated before answering. Now, sir, I am a man who fears he may be losing his reason. Holmes' eyes brightened instantly. Ah, said he softly, at last something interesting. I observed the Colonel flinch at the remark, though Holmes appeared entirely unconscious of discourtesy. You have come to consult me regarding a danger which you cannot explain, Holmes continued. You suspect someone close to you, yet you lack evidence. Worse still, you doubt your own senses. The man gripped the arms of his chair. How in heaven's name? My dear sir, your gloves. Only then did I notice that Colonel Beaumont still wore a pair of pale grey gloves, despite the warmth of the room. Holmes pointed with languid precision. You have repeatedly tugged at the right glove during the past minute. A man does not conceal his hand without reason, yet your anxiety concerns not physical deformity, but moral implication. Therefore the hand contains evidence connecting you with something dreadful. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, the Colonel removed the glove from his right hand. I confess that I uttered an involuntary exclamation. Across the back of the hand, extending upward beneath the cuff, ran irregular crimson stains resembling splashes of dried blood. Yet they possessed a curious quality unlike ordinary discoloration. The marks appeared embedded within the flesh itself. I cannot remove them, whispered Beaumont. God help me. They return every morning. Holmes leaned forward sharply. How long has this phenomenon persisted? Nearly 3 weeks, and during that period, the Colonel swallowed hard. 3 men have died. The room fell silent, save for the hiss of rain against the windows. Holmes's expression, which had until then reflected only intellectual curiosity, grew suddenly intent. Proceed. Colonel Beaumont drew a folded newspaper clipping from his pocket and handed it to Holmes. My friend scanned it rapidly before tossing it across to me. The article described the death of one Percival Mowbray, a moneylender of dubious reputation, found in his study near Holborn. Though robbery had not occurred, the room displayed signs of violent struggle. Most remarkable was the fact that the victim's throat had been slashed with extraordinary savagery. No weapon had been recovered. What connection had you with this unfortunate man? Holmes asked. I knew him slightly, nothing more. And the second death? Without speaking, Beaumont produced another clipping. This time the victim was a retired actor named Julius Fern, discovered drowned in the Serpentine under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses claim to have seen him walking in Hyde Park shortly before midnight, in heated conversation with a tall gentleman carrying a silver-headed cane. The Colonel's cane rested across his knees. You were seen with him? I asked. Yes. Indeed, murmured Holmes. Highly unfortunate. Beaumont's face twitched violently upon the right side. I swear to you, Doctor. Watson, I did not kill either man. Holmes steepled his fingers. But you believe you may have done so. The Colonel closed his eyes. There are gaps in my memory. Ah, for several months I have suffered from dreadful lapses. Entire hours disappear. I wake in unfamiliar districts with no recollection of how I arrived there. Twice I discovered mud upon my boots, though I had no memory of leaving my rooms. Then came these stains upon my hand. He raised it miserably. The third death occurred 2 nights ago. A journalist named Edwin Mallory. His skull was crushed in an alley behind Fleet Street. Witnesses described a gentleman fleeing the scene. A gentleman with a limp. Holmes glanced instantly at the Colonel's right leg. A cavalry injury. Afghanistan. And naturally you fear arrest. I fear something worse, Mr. Holmes. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. I fear that another self exists within me. Holmes remained perfectly still. A second personality? You may laugh. I never laugh at facts. Beaumont stared into the fire. There are moments when I feel him awakening. A different mind. Colder, crueler. I see faces which I do not recognize. Streets unfamiliar to me. Sometimes I hear phrases spoken in my own voice, yet they seem uttered by another man entirely. A medical specialist, I suggested gently. I consulted 2. One declared it nervous exhaustion, the other hinted at hereditary instability. His fingers tightened convulsively upon the cane. Neither explained the murders. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window. For several minutes he stood peering into the fog-veiled street while Beaumont and I watched him in silence. At length he spoke without turning. "You have omitted something of importance, Colonel. I assure you. The omission concerns fear rather than guilt." Holmes pivoted suddenly. "Who is the woman?" The effect upon our visitor was extraordinary. Every trace of colour vanished from his face. "How did you know there was a woman?" "Because men endure suspicion for money, reputation, or ambition. They seek help only when a woman becomes endangered." Beaumont sank heavily back into the chair. "Her name is Clara Valewood." Holmes nodded as though confirming some private deduction. "She is young, yes, and wealthy?" "A modest inheritance." "You intend marriage?" The Colonel stared helplessly. "Yes." Holmes resumed his seat. "Then we approach the truth at last. Pray continue." Beaumont drew a shaking breath. "Miss Valewood became acquainted with me 6 months ago through charitable work, among veterans' families in Kensington. She is intelligent, compassionate, and utterly beyond my deserving. 3 weeks ago I asked for her hand. She accepted. And since then, she has received anonymous letters warning her against me." "What nature of warnings?" hesitated. "They claim that I am a murderer." Holmes' eyes flashed. "Have you seen these letters?" "Yes." "Preserved them?" "No, Clara, burned them. Pity." The Colonel pressed both hands against his temples. "At first I dismissed the matter as some cruel jest. Then came the death of Mowbray. After that the missing hours began. And now—" He looked despairingly at the stained hand. "Now even I begin to doubt myself." Holmes suddenly extended his own hand. "The glove, if you please." Beaumont surrendered it reluctantly. Holmes examined the interior lining with minute attention before carrying it to the lamp. For perhaps half a minute he studied some invisible detail. Then he smiled. A very dangerous smile. "My dear Colonel," said he softly, "you interest me profoundly. You believe me innocent. I believe nothing. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one possesses data." Holmes slipped the glove into his dressing-gown pocket. "However, I may say this. Your problem is considerably more complex than simple madness." Beaumont half rose from his chair. "Then there is hope." "There is always hope where human folly is involved." Holmes crossed to the mantelpiece and filled his pipe. "You will return to your residence and behave exactly as usual. Speak of this consultation to no one, not even Miss Valewood. Above all, if further lapses occur, record every detail immediately upon recovering consciousness. And if another murder takes place—" Holmes struck a match. "Then, Colonel Beaumont, we may all find ourselves in very grave danger indeed." The words hung heavily in the lamplit room. Our visitor departed soon afterward, disappearing into the yellow fog below Baker Street, with shoulders bent beneath invisible burdens. For some minutes Holmes smoked in silence. At last I spoke. "Well?" Without answering directly, he removed the grey glove from his pocket and tossed it toward me. "Smell it." I did so. A faint bitter odour clung to the leather. "Chemicals?" "Quite so." Holmes stretched himself upon the sofa, closing his eyes. "Specifically, a preparation used in theatrical cosmetics." "Theatrical?" "Yes." I stared at him. "But what possible connection?" Holmes opened one eye lazily. "My dear Watson, when a man presents us with two faces, it is generally prudent to ask which one belongs to him." Chapter 2. The House in Campden Grove. The singular interview with Colonel Beaumont left a deeper impression upon me than I cared at first to admit. There had been something peculiarly unsettling in the contrast between the man's soldierly bearing and the furtive terror which seemed to haunt him, like an unseen presence at his shoulder. More than once that night I found myself recalling the strange asymmetry of his face and the crimson marks upon his hand. Holmes, however, appeared wholly absorbed by the intellectual dimensions of the matter. Long after midnight he remained awake upon the sofa in his dressing-gown, surrounded by chemical monographs and newspaper files. Blue clouds of tobacco smoke drifted about the lamp while his sharp profile emerged and vanished through the haze, like that of some gaunt medieval scholar bent over forbidden studies. At 2 a.m, I rose irritably from my bedchamber. "Holmes," said I, "if you intend poisoning us both with that infernal tobacco, you might at least explain your conclusions." Without glancing up, he extended one long arm toward a sheaf of papers. "There are no conclusions, only converging probabilities. That is merely another of your phrases. On the contrary, it is the precise distinction between success and failure." He tapped the newspaper clipping concerning the murdered moneylender. "Observe, Watson, 3 men are dead. At first glance they possess nothing in common beyond possible association with Colonel Beaumont." "And you believe the association false?" "I believe it manufactured." Holmes selected the clipping describing the drowned actor, Julius Fern, 56 years of age, minor performer of melodramatic roles at provincial theatres, notable chiefly for expertise in disguise and facial cosmetics. He handed me a marked passage. "Read the final paragraph." I obeyed aloud. "Mr. Fern was known among theatrical circles for his extraordinary ability to alter his appearance through subtle muscular manipulation and grease paint applications. Younger actors frequently consulted him regarding stage transformation." Holmes nodded. "Now combine that with the chemical odour within Beaumont's glove. You think Fern disguised him? Possibly, or taught someone else to do so." I frowned. "But why?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, if one could answer why, the remainder would become comparatively trivial." He rose suddenly and crossed to the mantelpiece where his violin rested. "There is another point. Colonel Beaumont stated that anonymous letters warned Miss Valewood he was a murderer." "Yes." "Meaning someone wished her frightened. Surely that suggests Beaumont himself may indeed be guilty." Holmes drew the bow once across the strings, producing a low, melancholy note, "or suggests that another party desired her to believe him guilty. You perceive a distinction where none exists. Ah, Watson, there speaks the excellent physician and the indifferent logician." Holmes settled into his chair with the violin beneath his chin. "A man who commits murder generally seeks concealment. A man who advertises murder pursues another object altogether." Before I could answer, he began to play. There are moments when Holmes's violin conveyed emotions which his cold and disciplined intellect refused to express in words. That night the music possessed a restless, uneasy quality unlike his usual dreamy improvisations. Sharp, discordant phrases rose and fell through the room, while outside the fog pressed heavily against the windows. At length he stopped abruptly. "We shall visit Campden Grove tomorrow." "Where is that?" "Colonel Beaumont's residence. A melancholy little house inherited from an aunt." Holmes laid aside the violin. I confessed myself curious regarding the domestic arrangements. "And Miss Valewood?" "She resides with an elderly companion in Lancaster Gate. We shall postpone that interview." Holmes extinguished the lamp. "Come, Watson. Tomorrow may prove instructive." The following morning broke cold and colourless beneath a sky of dull pewter. A thin rain drifted over London, rendering the pavements greasy beneath the wheels of passing hansoms. Holmes appeared unusually animated during breakfast, consuming coffee with rapid, absent-minded movements, while his gaze remained fixed upon some invisible chain of reasoning. At 10:30 we found ourselves driving westward through Kensington toward Campden Grove. The district possessed an air of faded gentility. Narrow brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder behind black iron railings, their windows dimmed by years of soot and damp. Here and there neglected gardens drooped beneath autumn rain. The entire street seemed oppressed by silence. Number 17 proved to be a tall, sombre residence with green shutters and a weather-stained brass knocker. A maid admitted us after evident hesitation. "Colonel Beaumont is not receiving callers, sir." Holmes handed her his card. "You may nevertheless announce us." We were shown into a narrow morning room overlooking the street. The apartment bore unmistakable signs of masculine solitude. Military prints adorned the walls beside Indian curiosities and faded regimental photographs. Everything appeared orderly to the point of severity, yet subtle indications suggested recent disturbance. A vase lay broken beside the hearth. One curtain had been hastily refastened after tearing loose. Most striking of all, a writing desk near the window showed deep scratches across the polished wood, as though made by violent fingernails. Holmes examined these details without comment. Presently Colonel Beaumont entered. I was shocked by the alteration in his appearance since the previous evening. His face seemed drawn and grey, while dark hollows encircled his eyes. Most disturbing of all was the increased asymmetry of his features. The twitch upon the right side had grown more pronounced. "You have not slept," said Holmes quietly. "No. Another lapse." The colonel hesitated. "I scarcely know." Holmes motioned toward a chair. "Describe it precisely." Beaumont passed a trembling hand across his brow. "I retired shortly, after returning from Baker Street. Around midnight I awoke downstairs in this room. Fully dressed, yes. What had awakened you?" The colonel swallowed hard. There was someone here. Holmes became instantly alert. "In this room? Yes. You saw only briefly. What sort of man?" Beaumont stared into the fire. "That is the dreadful part, Mr. Holmes." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "He looked exactly like me." Even Holmes' expression sharpened perceptibly. "You are certain?" "As certain as I am sitting before you now." I could not suppress an exclamation. "Nonsense. Some trick of the light." The colonel shook his head violently. He stood near the window with his back half turned toward me. I saw the same height, the same shoulders, the same limp. Beaumont pressed both hands against his temples. Then he smiled. "And vanished?" "No, I think I lost consciousness." Holmes leaned forward. "When you recovered yourself, it was nearly dawn. The room looked as you see it now." He gestured toward the broken vase and torn curtain. "And your hand?" Slowly Beaumont removed the grey glove. Fresh crimson stains spread across the flesh like branching veins. "My God," murmured I. Holmes took the hand firmly beneath the lamp. For several seconds he studied the marks in complete silence. Then he released the colonel abruptly. "You have washed repeatedly?" "Yes." "And unsuccessfully?" "Yes." Holmes crossed at once to the writing desk. "Did you write anything during the night?" "Not knowingly." Holmes opened the blotter. Beneath it lay a single torn fragment of paper, bearing several hurried lines in jagged handwriting. "He must not speak again, the woman knows nothing." "Tonight, if necessary," Holmes' eyes flashed. "Interesting." "You recognize the writing?" asked Beaumont hoarsely. Holmes handed him the paper. The colonel recoiled visibly. "It resembles my own hand." "Resembles?" "Not entirely. The strokes are harsher somehow. More angular." Holmes suddenly bent near the desk itself. "Ah!" He produced a small lens from his pocket. "What do you see?" I asked. "A curiosity." He pointed toward faint grey smudges near the inkstand. "Grease paint." The colonel stared blankly. "But how could theatrical paint come here?" "That, Colonel, is precisely the question." Holmes rose and wandered slowly about the room, with hands clasped behind his back. I had long learned that such periods of apparent idleness signified the most intense mental activity. At last he paused before a framed photograph upon the mantelpiece. The portrait depicted a younger Beaumont in military uniform, beside another officer of similar age. Unlike the colonel, this second man possessed dark, sharp features and deeply set eyes of unusual intensity. Holmes lifted the frame. "Your companion?" "My cousin." "Reginald Beaumont." "Alive?" "No. Dead these 12 years." "Indeed?" Holmes continued studying the photograph. "How did he die?" "In Rangoon. Fever." The answer came too quickly. Holmes glanced up sharply. "You are certain?" "Of course." "Yet you dislike mentioning him." A flicker of irritation crossed Beaumont's face. "We were not intimate. Nevertheless you preserved his portrait." The colonel gave a weary shrug. "He was my only relative." Holmes replaced the photograph gently. "Tell me, Colonel, have you ever before suffered these lapses of memory?" "Never. No history of mental illness within the family." "None. Nor opium, chloral, or other narcotics?" Certainly not. Holmes nodded as though satisfied. Then, quite unexpectedly, he asked, "Did your cousin resemble you closely?" Beaumont blinked. "Moderately, perhaps. Enough to be mistaken for you in poor light." The Colonel hesitated. "I suppose so." Holmes turned away casually, but I knew him too well not to detect the significance he attached to the reply. At that moment the maid entered hurriedly. "A gentleman to see you, Colonel." "His name—" "He would not give it, sir." Before Beaumont could answer, a voice sounded from the hall. "I fancy no introduction is necessary." The newcomer entered immediately. He was a broad-shouldered man of about 40, with aggressive whiskers and bright, watchful eyes. His clothing was expensive, though somewhat flamboyant, and he carried himself with the easy assurance of one accustomed to forcing his presence upon unwilling company. Colonel Beaumont rose abruptly. "You?" The man smiled unpleasantly. "My dear Alistair, surely old acquaintances need not stand upon ceremony." Holmes observed him keenly. "And you are?" "Edgar Pell." The man removed his gloves with leisurely insolence. "A friend of the Colonel's family." "I was unaware," said Holmes smoothly, "that Colonel Beaumont possessed friends in such abundance." Pell's gaze shifted instantly toward him. "Ah, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, unless I mistake." "You seldom do?" "Only when profitable." Holmes smiled faintly. "An admirable principle." The two men regarded one another with unmistakable hostility. Pell turned back toward Beaumont. "I came regarding the newspaper reports. I have nothing to say." "Oh, but perhaps you should." Pell's tone hardened subtly. "People are beginning to talk." The Colonel's face darkened. "You had no right coming here." "My dear fellow, discretion benefits everyone." Holmes intervened lazily. "You interest yourself greatly in the Colonel's affairs, Mr. Pell. I dislike scandal, and yet you seem remarkably informed concerning it." Pell shrugged. "London is a village, Mr. Holmes." Holmes' eyes drifted briefly toward the man's hands. I noticed then that his right thumb bore traces of dark cosmetic beneath the nail. Only Holmes' sudden stillness revealed the importance of the observation. Pell followed his gaze instinctively and slipped his gloves back on at once. "A filthy morning," said he lightly. "Quite so," murmured Holmes. For an instant something dangerous passed silently between them. Then Pell bowed. "I shall not intrude further, Colonel." He departed without another word. The moment the front door closed, Holmes sprang to the window. We watched the man emerge into the rainy street and disappear through drifting mist. Holmes remained silent for perhaps half a minute. Then he spoke very softly. "Watson, yes, that gentleman is either the solution to this mystery." He slipped the lens back into his pocket. "Or the most accomplished liar we have yet encountered." Chapter 3. The Whisper in the Fog. For nearly an hour after our departure from Campden Grove Holmes remained unusually silent. We rode eastward through the damp London streets in a hansom whose windows rattled ceaselessly beneath the chill October wind. The city possessed that peculiar, oppressive melancholy which settles upon it during prolonged fogs. A sensation as though the vast metropolis itself were holding its breath. Holmes leaned back with closed eyes and fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. I knew better than to interrupt him prematurely. At last, somewhere near Oxford Street, he opened his eyes abruptly. "Watson," said he, "what impression did Edgar Pell produce upon you?" "A disagreeable one." "Excellent. Your instincts remain sound where your reasoning fails. I thought you discouraged instinct. In detection, yes. In character, never entirely." Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. "Pell is dangerous. You believe him connected with the murders?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "I believe him connected with fear. Whether that fear arises from guilt or merely self-preservation remains uncertain." "And the grease paint upon his thumb?" "A theatrical preparation identical in odour to that found within Colonel Beaumont's glove." "That seems highly incriminating." "Possibly." Holmes gazed through the blurred cab window. Yet obvious clues frequently conceal deeper artifices. I frowned impatiently. "My dear Holmes, you speak in riddles." "My dear Watson, the world itself speaks in riddles." "I merely listen more attentively." The hansom turned into Baker Street shortly thereafter. Holmes sprang out before the vehicle had fully stopped and hurried upstairs with unusual energy. "Telegram forms," he cried to Mrs. Hudson, "and send a boy at once." Within minutes he had dispatched no fewer than 5 telegrams to various quarters of London. One went to a theatrical costumier in Drury Lane, another to Scotland Yard, while the remaining 3 vanished into the mysterious network of Holmes' private inquiries. When he had finished, he lit a fresh pipe and stretched himself upon the sofa. We now wait. For what? For London to answer. It was near 4 o'clock that the first reply arrived. Holmes tore open the envelope and scanned its contents rapidly. Ah, well, our friend Julius Fern was more interesting than the newspapers suggested. Holmes tossed me the telegram. Read. The message came from an acquaintance connected with the theatrical profession. Fern returred 3 years ago, after private engagement with Und. Patron stop reputed master of facial. Altiation stop noun to have studied continental. Methods of cosmetic disguise, stop associated, recently with mon nom of Pell. I looked up sharply. So Pell knew the dead actor. Intimately, it would appear. That settles it surely. Nothing is settled. Holmes reached for another telegram as it arrived from the street below. Observe how facts multiply before conclusions stabilize. This second message proved considerably shorter. Mowbray and Mallory, both members of Hesperus Club. Fleet Street Holmes sat upright instantly. "Now that," said he softly, "is genuinely curious. What is the Hesperus Club? A literary and political dining society of moderate influence. Journalists, actors, barristers, colonial officers. The usual assortment of ambitious men pretending sophistication. And all 3 victims belonged, apparently." Holmes rose and crossed swiftly to the bookshelf, where he consulted a bulky directory. Founded 1878. Rooms in Bloomsbury. His eyes narrowed. Interesting indeed. I could not restrain my impatience longer. "For heaven's sake, Holmes, explain." He smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, we now possess the first genuine thread connecting the dead men independently of Colonel Beaumont. Therefore either Beaumont also belonged to the club, or someone wishes us to think he did." At that instant the bell downstairs rang violently. Rapid footsteps sounded upon the stair. Mrs. Hudson entered pale with agitation. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She insists the matter is urgent." "Show her in." The visitor who entered a moment later struck me at once as one of the most remarkable women I had encountered in Holmes's company. She was perhaps 26 years of age, slender and graceful, dressed in dark travelling clothes, still glistening from rain. Her features possessed uncommon refinement, though anxiety had robbed them of colour. A pair of clear grey eyes, intelligent and steadfast, moved quickly from Holmes to myself. Holmes bowed. "Miss Clara Valewood, I presume." She started. "You know me? My profession obliges me to know many things." Her composure faltered slightly. "Then Colonel Beaumont has already consulted you." "He has. Thank God." The words escaped her involuntarily. Holmes motioned toward a chair. "You are distressed, Miss Valewood." "I am frightened, Mr. Holmes." There was nothing theatrical in her manner. Indeed, what impressed me most was the evident effort with which she controlled herself. Holmes watched her with keen attention. "You continue to trust Colonel Beaumont despite recent events?" "Yes." "Why?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I know him." "A dangerous argument," said Holmes quietly. "Many women have said the same upon the eve of disaster." A faint flush rose to her cheeks. "You think me foolish." "I think you loyal. The distinction is considerable." Miss Valewood clasped her gloved hands tightly together. "I came because something occurred this morning." Holmes leaned forward. "Proceed." "An elderly gentleman called at my residence shortly after 10 o'clock. He claimed to be acting in Colonel Beaumont's interests. Describe him: tall, very thin, grey whiskers. He wore spectacles with blue lenses." Holmes exchanged a rapid glance with me. "A disguise," he murmured. "The man seemed greatly agitated," she continued. "He warned me that the Colonel suffered from violent attacks, during which he became entirely another person." "What precisely were his words?" She closed her eyes briefly in recollection. "There are 2 men living inside Alistair Beaumont," he said. "One honourable, one monstrous. Pray heaven you never meet the second." Holmes' expression remained unreadable. "And you believed him?" "At first, no. Then he showed me something." "What?" Miss Vailwood drew a folded sheet of paper from her reticule. "A letter." Holmes unfolded it carefully. I saw at once that the handwriting resembled the jagged script found upon Beaumont's desk. The message read, "Clara, for your own safety, you must leave London. Immediately I cannot answer for what I may do A.B. Holmes studied the signature intently. "When was this written?" "I do not know. The stranger claimed the Colonel had no memory of composing it." "And afterward?" "The gentleman left almost immediately. Less than an hour later I received another visitor." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Indeed," she nodded. "Mr. Edgar Pell." Holmes uttered a soft sound very close to satisfaction. "What did he desire?" "He urged me to break my engagement at once." "On what grounds?" "He claimed Colonel Beaumont had been involved in disgraceful affairs years ago in India." Her voice trembled slightly. "He implied there had once been another death." Holmes sat perfectly still. "What sort of death?" He would not say directly. She hesitated, but he repeatedly referred to a cousin. For the first time since her arrival, Holmes showed unmistakable excitement. "Did he name this cousin?" "Yes, Reginald Beaumont." Holmes sprang to his feet. "Excellent." Miss Vailwood recoiled slightly at the sudden exclamation. "My apologies," said Holmes quickly. "You have rendered invaluable assistance. You know what it means?" "Not yet, but I begin to perceive where the shadows lie." He paced rapidly once across the room before turning sharply back toward her. "One question more, Miss Vailwood. Has Colonel Beaumont ever spoken to you regarding his service in Burma?" "Very little. He dislikes discussing the East." "Did he ever mention Rangoon specifically?" "No." Holmes nodded. "Good. I confess I saw nothing good in the matter whatsoever." Miss Vailwood rose anxiously. "Mr. Holmes, tell me honestly, do you believe Alistair Beaumont capable of these crimes?" Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "My dear young lady, capability and guilt are seldom identical. That is not an answer. It is the only truthful one available." She lowered her eyes. "I understand." "No," said Holmes gently. "I fancy you do not. But perhaps before this affair concludes we all shall." He escorted her personally to the door, an unusual courtesy on his part. When he returned his expression had altered completely. The languid detachment vanished. In its place appeared the hard bright concentration which I had observed only in his most dangerous investigations. Without speaking, he seized his coat and revolver from the shelf. "Come, Watson." "Where are we going?" "To the Hesperus Club." The establishment occupied a narrow building near Bloomsbury Square and presented an exterior of respectable dullness. Inside, however, we found richly furnished rooms heavy with tobacco smoke and political conversation. A steward admitted us reluctantly after hearing Holmes's name. The membership proved exactly as Holmes had described. Journalists arguing parliamentary gossip beside aging actors, colonial officials, and literary gentlemen of uncertain occupation. Holmes moved among them with deceptive indifference. Within minutes he had drawn the steward into conversation. "Sad business regarding Mr. Mallory," said he casually. The steward nodded grimly. "Terrible, sir. 3rd member gone inside a month. Indeed, the club has suffered greatly. Very unfortunate." Holmes lowered his voice confidentially. "I understand Colonel Beaumont was acquainted with the deceased gentleman." The steward blinked. "Colonel Beaumont, sir?" "Yes, I do not know the name." Holmes' eyes flashed almost imperceptibly. "Surely he belonged here." "No, sir. Never. Never to my knowledge." Holmes thanked him and drifted away. I followed in bewilderment. "Well?" "My dear Watson," he murmured, "Colonel Beaumont lied." "About belonging to the club? More significant still, about not knowing the victims." Before I could respond, Holmes abruptly caught my arm. Across the smoking room, partially concealed behind a newspaper, sat Edgar Pell, and directly opposite him, his face hidden in shadow beneath a lowered hat, sat a second man whose posture struck me with peculiar familiarity. At that instant the stranger lifted his head slightly. I nearly cried aloud. For though the face remained obscured, the profile was unmistakably that of Colonel Beaumont. Chapter 4. The second face at the window. For one extraordinary instant I remained frozen in astonishment. The resemblance between the seated stranger and Colonel Beaumont was so exact that my mind instinctively rejected what my eyes plainly reported. The same military bearing, the same angular shoulders, the same slight inclination of the head, as though the man carried some invisible burden perpetually upon one side. Only Holmes retained complete composure. Without the slightest alteration in expression, he drew me backward into the shelter of a nearby alcove. "Not a word," he murmured, "but Holmes, that man, observe before theorizing." Across the room, Edgar Pell continued speaking in low, urgent tones. The other man listened motionlessly. Smoke drifted between them beneath the yellow gaslight, rendering the scene curiously unreal. "Surely Beaumont cannot be in two places at once," I whispered. "My dear Watson, you perceive at last the essential difficulty." Holmes removed his watch casually. "Notice the hands." I peered again. The seated man's gloves lay upon the table beside his glass. His right hand remained partially visible beneath the lamp. Unlike Colonel Beaumont's stained and twitching fingers, this hand appeared perfectly steady. "Now the ears," said Holmes softly. "What about them?" "The lobes." I stared harder. Good heavens! The ears were different. The stranger's right lobe lay flatter against the head, while Beaumont's projected slightly outward due to an old scar tissue fold. The discrepancy was minute, so minute that I should never have detected it unaided. "You see," murmured Holmes. "A double? Perhaps." Before further explanation became possible, Pell suddenly glanced across the room, his eyes fixed directly upon us. For a brief instant his expression hardened with unmistakable alarm. Then almost immediately he recovered himself and smiled thinly. The man opposite him did not turn. "Come," said Holmes quietly. To my amazement he walked straight toward their table. Pell rose halfway from his chair. "Mr. Holmes, what a coincidence." "There are no coincidences, Mr. Pell, only intersections of design." Holmes' tone remained perfectly cordial. The seated stranger slowly lifted his face. I confess that even prepared as I now was, the shock proved considerable. The resemblance to Colonel Beaumont remained extraordinary. Yet here, face to face, the distinctions became apparent. This man possessed darker eyes, a firmer jaw, and an expression wholly unlike the Colonel's haunted anxiety. There was something coldly alert in his gaze, a predatory intelligence concealed beneath polished manners. Holmes bowed slightly. "You have the advantage of me, sir." The stranger smiled. Victor Harland. His voice differed also, smoother, deeper, touched with faint amusement. "A pleasure," said Holmes. "I doubt that." Holmes laughed softly. "Excellent. Candour is refreshing." Pell intervened quickly. "Mr. Harland has only lately arrived from the continent." "Indeed." Holmes' eyes remained fixed upon the man's face. "And yet London seems already familiar to him." Harland's smile widened almost imperceptibly. "I adapt quickly, so I perceive." A tense silence followed. I had often witnessed Holmes confronting dangerous men, but seldom had I sensed hostility so immediate and concealed. One felt rather than saw the silent probing beneath their apparently harmless exchange. At last Harland rose. "If you will excuse us, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Pell and I were discussing private matters." "Concerning Colonel Beaumont?" The effect was instantaneous. Pell stiffened sharply. Harland alone preserved composure. "I do not know the gentleman." "Curious." Holmes' eyes glittered faintly. "Because you resemble him remarkably." Harland shrugged lightly. "I have been told as much before. And yet the resemblance appears more than accidental." The man's gaze hardened. "Careful, Mr. Holmes. Advice from strangers seldom profits me." Pell stepped forward abruptly. "This conversation has gone far enough." Holmes regarded him with lazy contempt. "My dear Mr. Pell, when conversation ceases, investigation begins. You may find the transition unpleasant." Without another word he turned and walked calmly toward the exit. I followed in bewilderment. Only once we had regained the street did I speak. Holmes, who in heaven's name was that man? Holmes drew a deep breath of cold, foggy air. That, Watson, is the first genuinely dangerous figure we have encountered. You believe him connected with the murders? I believe him connected with nearly everything. But the resemblance? Yes, Holmes hailed a passing hansom. A resemblance so close that one might easily mistake one for the other beneath poor lighting. You think Harland impersonated Beaumont? Undoubtedly. Then Beaumont is innocent. Holmes settled into the cab before answering. Innocence remains relative, but we may safely conclude he has been manipulated. By Harland. Possibly through Harland. Whether Pell directs the scheme or merely participates remains uncertain. I stared at him. But why construct such an elaborate deception? Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Watson, if criminals employed simple methods, my profession would scarcely exist. The cab rolled southward through thickening fog. Holmes remained silent for several minutes before speaking again. There is another matter. Yes? Did you notice Harland's left cuff? No, a faint brown discoloration near the wrist. What of it, stage adhesive? I groaned. More theatrical materials. Precisely. Our dead actor Julius Fern instructed someone very thoroughly. Holmes leaned back with closed eyes. The question is whether Fern taught Harland to become Beaumont, or Beaumont to become Harland. That evening Inspector Lestrade arrived unexpectedly at Baker Street. The little detective appeared, damp, irritable, and unusually self-satisfied. Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Doctor? Holmes glanced up lazily from his correspondence. You bring news. I bring an arrest. Holmes sighed. How premature. Lestrade bristled instantly. You haven't heard the particulars yet. My dear Lestrade, whenever you appear pleased with yourself before 9 o'clock, someone has almost certainly been arrested incorrectly. The inspector ignored the remark. We've taken Colonel Beaumont. I sprang from my chair. What? Found enough evidence to hang him twice over, said Lestrade grimly. Blood traces on clothing. Witnesses placing him near Mallory before the murder. And now this. He produced a folded paper. Holmes took it indifferently. The document proved to be a pawn receipt, dated 2 days earlier, for a heavy silver watch identified as belonging to the murdered moneylender Mowbray. Issued in Colonel Beaumont's name. Well? Demanded Lestrade triumphantly. Holmes examined the receipt beneath the lamp. Where was this discovered? In Beaumont's bedroom. Convenient. Lestrade frowned. You think it planted? I think everything about this case convenient. Holmes handed back the receipt. Which makes it inherently suspicious. The inspector snorted. You always say that when evidence becomes straightforward. Because evidence seldom becomes straightforward naturally. Human beings are not tidy enough. Lestrade seated himself aggressively. There's more. Beaumont attempted to conceal his connection with the dead men. Holmes' eyes sharpened slightly. Go on. He knew all 3 victims through the Hesperus Club. I started, but Beaumont denied membership. Exactly. Because he used another name, Holmes became very still. What name? Lestrade consulted his notebook. Victor Harland. For perhaps 3 seconds absolute silence filled the room. Then Holmes laughed aloud, not pleasantly. My dear Lestrade, said he softly, you have just stumbled within an inch of the truth without recognizing it. The inspector flushed angrily. What do you mean by that? Holmes rose and crossed to the fire. Tell me precisely how you obtained this information. One of the club servants identified Beaumont from photographs. After how long? What difference does that make? A considerable one. Lestrade hesitated. About an hour. Ah, Holmes nodded slowly. And during that hour someone suggested the name Victor Harland. The inspector stared. How the devil? Elementary. Lestrade rose indignantly. You may mock all you like, Mr. Holmes. But Beaumont is in custody, and the Crown will have little difficulty proving its case. Holmes turned sharply. Where is he held? Bow Street. I shall see him immediately. Not tonight, you won't. Holmes' expression altered. In an instant, every trace of indolence vanished. Listen carefully, Lestrade. If Colonel Beaumont remains unguarded, Another murder will occur before morning. The inspector blinked. You're becoming dramatic. I am becoming accurate. Something in Holmes's tone penetrated even Lestrade's stubbornness. What exactly are you suggesting? That Beaumont is not the hunter in this affair. Holmes seized his coat. He is bait. We reached Bow Street shortly before midnight. Rain lashed the pavement, while policemen moved like blurred shadows through the gaslit yard. Lestrade, though unconvinced, had reluctantly accompanied us. The sergeant on duty admitted us to a narrow corridor lined with holding cells. Prisoner's been quiet, he remarked. Almost too quiet. We stopped outside the final door. From within came no sound whatsoever. Lestrade unlocked the cell personally. The moment the door swung open, Holmes uttered a sharp oath. The compartment was empty. For one bewildered instant, none of us moved. Then Lestrade cried out, "Impossible!" Holmes darted forward. The barred window remained closed. The door showed no sign of tampering. Yet Colonel Beaumont had vanished utterly. Only one object lay upon the wooden bench inside. A small, grey theatrical sponge, still damp with grease paint. Holmes picked it up carefully. Then his eyes lifted toward the wall opposite the bench. Written there in crimson letters were 6 words. There are always 2 faces. Behind me, Lestrade whispered hoarsely. Good God! Holmes said nothing, but I saw, for the first time since this extraordinary affair began, genuine uneasiness enter his eyes. Chapter V. The Man Who Vanished from Bow Street. The disappearance of Colonel Beaumont from a locked police cell created, as may readily be imagined, a sensation approaching panic within Bow Street Station. Lestrade stormed through the corridor in furious disbelief, while constables searched every passage, office, and courtyard with mounting confusion. Yet from the beginning Holmes displayed none of their agitation. Indeed, his calmness amidst the uproar struck me as almost unnatural. He stood silently within the empty cell, examining the surroundings with minute attention. At length he knelt beside the bench. "Observe, Watson." I joined him. Near one leg of the bench appeared several tiny white granules, scarcely visible against the worn stone floor. "Plaster dust," said Holmes softly. "From the wall?" "No. From theatrical moulding compound." He rose and approached the barred window. "The bars remain intact. Therefore Beaumont did not escape through them." Lestrade exploded. "Then how the devil did he leave?" Holmes pointed calmly toward the corridor, through the door. "But the door was locked." "Certainly." "You're talking nonsense." "My dear Lestrade, when all impossible exits are eliminated, one must examine the obvious entrance, the—" Inspector glared at him. "You're suggesting someone simply walked out with the prisoner." "I am suggesting," said Holmes, "that at some point during the evening the individual occupying this cell ceased to be Colonel Beaumont." The sergeant on duty stared blankly. "I don't follow, sir." Holmes picked up the damp theatrical sponge. "Then permit me to illuminate you. Suppose a man strongly resembling Beaumont were introduced here temporarily. Suppose further that such resemblance could be enhanced through cosmetic alteration." Lestrade's face slowly darkened. "The double. Precisely. And the real Beaumont? Removed earlier." The inspector uttered a savage curse. "But every officer here saw him." Holmes smiled thinly. "My dear fellow, London audiences nightly mistake painted actors for kings, beggars, and bishops from 30 feet away. Why should tired policemen prove more perceptive?" Lestrade paced violently. "Someone inside helped them." "Undoubtedly." Holmes moved suddenly toward the cell door. "Who last brought food to the prisoner?" The sergeant swallowed. "Constable Wilkes, sir. Fetch him." The man hurried away. Holmes meanwhile bent to examine the lock itself with his lens. "Interesting. What now?" I asked. "A faint trace of spirit gum upon the keyhole." "Meaning?" "Our visitors worked quickly." Holmes straightened. "Very quickly indeed." Constable Wilkes soon arrived, a florid young officer trembling visibly beneath Lestrade's wrath. "Well," barked the inspector, "I swear I noticed nothing unusual, sir. What time did you bring the meal?" 9:30. "And the prisoner?" "Sitting on the bench, sir." Holmes intervened quietly. Did he speak? Wilkes hesitated. No, sir, not a single word. He seemed ill. Did he raise his head? Only once. And the lighting? The corridor lamp, sir. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. You delivered the tray through the hatch? Yes. Without fully opening the door? That's correct. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. The entire substitution had become horribly clear. Lestrade seized the constable by the sleeve. You fool! You never properly saw the man at all. Wilkes turned pale. Holmes, however, remained absorbed elsewhere. He had moved again toward the crimson writing upon the wall. There are always two faces. He studied the words intently. At first glance, theatrical melodrama, said he softly, yet perhaps more revealing than intended. How so? I asked. The lettering. I peered closer. The final word, faces, displayed a slight downward slant unlike the preceding lines. Holmes touched it carefully. Written by a different hand pressure. You think two people wrote it? Not consciously. I stared. What on earth do you mean? Holmes turned away slowly. I mean, Watson, that our adversary may possess the most dangerous quality imaginable. His eyes hardened. A divided identity used deliberately rather than suffered involuntarily. Before I could press him further, Lestrade returned angrily from questioning the station staff. No carriage seen, no strangers observed. It's madness. Not madness, said Holmes. Preparation. The inspector stopped short. You know who did this. I know who planned it. Then, speak plainly for once. Holmes slipped the theatrical sponge into his pocket. Very well. Edgar Pell, and the man calling himself Victor Harland, removed Beaumont from custody. Lestrade snorted. And the motive? To continue the performance. What performance? Holmes' gaze became distant. That remains obscured. For the first time since entering the station, I sensed genuine frustration beneath his composure. And that fact troubled me more deeply than all else. It was nearly 2:00 in the morning when we returned to Baker Street. A bitter wind swept through the city, scattering fog in ragged streamers beneath the lamps. Holmes had scarcely spoken during the journey home. His silence now possessed none of its usual meditative calm. Rather, it suggested intense inward conflict. The moment we entered our rooms, he crossed directly to the chemical table and began searching among various bottles and instruments. What are you doing? I asked. Testing a theory. He selected a narrow glass slide and scraped upon it a minute quantity of crimson residue from Beaumont's glove. Hand me the nitric acid, I complied. For several minutes Holmes worked rapidly over the spirit lamp while I watched in growing curiosity. At length he uttered a sharp exclamation. Well? He held the slide beneath the light. The crimson stain had altered to a muddy brown. Not blood, said Holmes. What then? A vegetable pigment mixed with iron salts. I stared in astonishment. The stains were artificial. Entirely. But Beaumont believed exactly. Holmes set down the slide abruptly. Our unknown friends wished him terrified. They required him convinced that he committed murder during unconscious intervals. But why? Holmes gave an impatient gesture. To weaken his certainty, to undermine his confidence in his own perceptions. He began pacing rapidly across the room. Imagine it, Watson. Anonymous warnings, missing hours, manufactured evidence, a double appearing in darkness. Gradually the victim ceases trusting memory itself. You think Beaumont never suffered genuine lapses? Oh, the lapses were real enough. Holmes stopped beside the fire. Drug-induced, most likely. Drugged by whom? That, said Holmes grimly, is precisely where the problem becomes interesting. He drew suddenly from his pocket the photograph of young Beaumont and his cousin Reginald. Look carefully. I obeyed. Now that Holmes had directed my attention toward resemblance, I perceived it far more strongly than before. Though not identical, the cousins possessed undeniable similarity of structure about the brow and mouth. Remarkable, I murmured. Yes. Holmes tapped the photograph thoughtfully, particularly when combined with Pell's references to an earlier death. You no longer believe Reginald Beaumont died in Rangoon? Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Watson, whenever a man dies conveniently abroad, One should preserve scepticism. A sudden knock sounded below. Both of us looked up sharply. Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a sealed envelope. "A boy delivered this by hand, Mr. Holmes." Holmes broke the seal immediately. As he read, I saw his expression alter with extraordinary rapidity, from concentration to surprise, and finally to something very near alarm. "What is it?" Without answering, he handed me the note. The message consisted of only a single sentence. "If you wish to see Coronel Beaumont alive, comb alone to Blackthorn Wharf at 3 o'clock. No signature appeared. I looked up quickly. "You cannot possibly go." "On the contrary." Holmes reached calmly for his revolver drawer. "I must. It is obviously a trap." "My dear fellow, all worthwhile interviews are traps. You said alone." "Yes, and you intend taking me regardless." Holmes smiled briefly. "Your medical assistance may prove indispensable." Within 10 minutes we were once more abroad in the sleeping city. The journey eastward seemed interminable. Rain slashed sideways through narrow streets, while the river fog thickened into pale shifting walls along the embankment. The very atmosphere of London appeared transformed after midnight. Familiar thoroughfares became sinister and unfamiliar beneath wavering gaslight. Blackthorn Wharf lay in a desolate district near the river bends below Limehouse. Decaying warehouses loomed beside black water, where barges creaked invisibly within the mist. The entire place smelled of wet timber, coal smoke, and tidal mud. Holmes moved ahead swiftly and silently. "Careful," he murmured. We approached a narrow warehouse standing partially apart from the others. A faint yellow light glimmered through cracked shutters. Holmes paused suddenly. "What is it?" I whispered. "Listen." From somewhere inside came the sound of laughter. Not ordinary laughter. It rose brokenly in uneven bursts, as though two entirely different men laughed simultaneously through the same throat. Even Holmes stiffened. Then a voice called clearly from within. "Enter, Mr. Holmes. You are expected." Holmes pushed open the warehouse door. The interior proved vast and shadowy. Crates and packing cases stood stacked beneath hanging lamps whose weak glow scarcely penetrated the gloom. At the centre of the floor sat Colonel Beaumont tied to a chair. He appeared pale and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. Standing behind him was Victor Harland, and beside Harland, smiling lazily with gloved hands clasped behind his back, stood Edgar Pell. "Well done," said Pell pleasantly. "Punctuality is such an underrated virtue." Holmes did not move further into the room. "You requested my presence. Here I am." Harland's eyes glittered strangely in the lamplight. "Yes," said he softly. "At last we meet properly." Something in the man's tone chilled me profoundly, for the voice now sounded astonishingly like Colonel Beaumont's. Holmes heard it too. I saw the realization strike him with electric force. In that instant the entire dreadful possibility became visible behind his eyes. And for perhaps the first time in our long association, Sherlock Holmes looked genuinely shaken. Chapter 6. The Warehouse of Two Voices. For a moment after Harland spoke, even Holmes remained motionless. The warehouse seemed to contract around us, its hanging lamps swaying slightly, its shadows deepening between stacked crates, as though the building itself had become aware of the deception unfolding within it. Colonel Beaumont sat bound to the chair at the centre of the floor. His head was lowered, yet I could see his jaw clenched with exhausted fury. Behind him Victor Harland stood with easy confidence. Edgar Pell remained slightly to one side, watching everything with the quiet satisfaction of a man observing a calculation finally reaching completion. Holmes broke the silence first. "You have been busy," he said calmly. Pell smiled. "We prefer efficiency." Holmes took a single step forward. "Release him." Harland laughed softly. "Already giving orders, Mr. Holmes. You are not yet in a position to negotiate." Holmes' gaze shifted briefly toward Beaumont. "You have failed to break him," he observed. "On the contrary," Harland replied. "We have already succeeded. The only question now is whether we keep him or replace him." The word replace hung in the air with disturbing clarity. Beaumont lifted his head suddenly. "Holmes, do not listen to them." His voice was hoarse, strained. I am still myself. Harland tilted his head. Are you? The simple question struck with unnerving force. Holmes turned slightly. Colonel, how many hours have you been conscious since yesterday morning? Beaumont hesitated. I do not know. Pell interjected smoothly. Exactly. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And how many men do you see in this room? Beaumont frowned. 3. Holmes nodded once. And how many voices do you hear? A pause. 3. A faint, unpleasant smile passed across Harland's lips. Interesting, murmured Holmes. I felt a chill crawl along my spine. Holmes continued. Tell me, Colonel, when you last remember yourself clearly, where were you? Beaumont's expression tightened painfully. At Campden Grove, after Miss Valewood's visit. And before that? His voice faltered. There is a gap. Holmes turned slightly toward Harland. A carefully maintained one, I presume. Carefully assisted, Harland corrected. Pell gave a light dismissive gesture. Enough of this, we are wasting time. Holmes's tone sharpened. Time is the only currency you appear to value. Harland stepped forward, slowly. You misunderstand us, Mr. Holmes. We are not here to conceal a crime. We are here to complete a transition. A transition? Yes. Pell smiled, faintly. Colonel Beaumont is no longer required in his current form. Beaumont struggled against the ropes. What are you talking about? Holmes did not look away from Harland. Explain. Harland spread his hands. Very well. The Colonel is a man with structural instability. A medical phrase for your convenience? Holmes asked coldly. A practical observation, Harland replied. Certain minds fracture under pressure. Others can be guided through that fracture. Holmes' eyes sharpened. And you have been guiding him? Correct. Pell added lightly. Since India. That single phrase altered the atmosphere instantly. Holmes turned his head slightly. India. Beaumont's face paled. Harland watched him closely. Yes, he said. Long before London, long before Miss Valewood, long before you. Holmes spoke slowly. Reginald Beaumont. A faint pause followed. Then Harland smiled. So you have reached that inference. Holmes remained silent. Pell paced a few steps. Reginald was the stronger version, he said conversationally. More adaptable. Less constrained by conscience. Beaumont's voice broke. That is impossible. He died in Rangoon. Harland laughed softly. Did he? Holmes spoke sharply. You falsified his death. Pell bowed slightly. Necessary at the time. For what purpose? Harland answered instead. To create distance. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Between identity and responsibility. Precisely, said Harland. A heavy silence followed. I found myself struggling to comprehend the implication forming before me. Holmes, however, seemed increasingly focused. So Colonel Beaumont believed his cousin dead? Yes, said Pell, and yet his cousin lived. Harland inclined his head. In a manner of speaking, Holmes' voice hardened. You replaced him. Not replaced, Harland corrected. Shared. Beaumont shook his head violently. I don't understand. This is madness. Holmes did not look at him. Colonel, he said quietly, have you ever experienced periods where your handwriting differed subtly from your usual script? Beaumont hesitated. Yes. And your voice, ever described as changed by those around you? Beaumont's face drained of colour. Yes. Holmes turned back to Harland. You administered drugs? Of course. And suggestion? Of course. And reinforcement through staged external identity. Pell clapped his hands lightly. Excellent, Mr. Holmes. You are following beautifully. Holmes's expression remained utterly cold. So your objective was not murder at all? Harland smiled. Not originally. Holmes stepped forward one pace. Then what changed? A pause. Harland's eyes drifted toward Beaumont. He resisted integration. Beaumont spat the words out. I resisted becoming a liar. Pell shrugged. Poetry. Holmes' gaze sharpened suddenly. And the murders? Harland answered without hesitation. Collateral necessity. Beaumont jerked violently. I did not kill those men. Harland looked at him with faint amusement. Not consciously. Holmes spoke slowly. Then explain Mowbray, Fern, and Mallory. Pell replied. All involved in the Hesperus Club. Yes. All acquainted with Reginald Beaumont. Holmes nodded once, and all capable of recognizing him. Harland leaned slightly forward, which made them liabilities. Holmes' eyes darkened. So you eliminated them? Not personally, Pell said smoothly, but consequences are rarely personal in execution. Beaumont's voice rose in anguish. You're insane. Holmes cut him off sharply. No, he is not. Silence fell instantly. Holmes continued. This is not madness. It is construction. He turned slightly. You were building a false identity across two men. Harland smiled faintly. One man, he corrected. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Two bodies. One function. Pell added softly. One purpose. Holmes exhaled slowly through his nose, and Colonel Beaumont was the unstable half. Harland nodded. Precisely. Beaumont shouted suddenly. I am not half of anything. The sound echoed through the warehouse. For the first time, Harland's calm expression tightened. Control him, he said quietly. Pell moved toward Beaumont. Holmes stepped forward at once. No. The single word halted Pell instantly. Holmes's voice remained low but carried unmistakable authority. If you touch him, this arrangement ends immediately. Harland studied Holmes carefully. You are in no position to threaten us. Holmes smiled faintly. I am not threatening you. He glanced briefly at the crates surrounding us. I am simply informing you. A faint sound came from somewhere in the warehouse above us. A scrape. Then another. Holmes looked upward sharply. Pell frowned. What was that? Holmes's expression changed subtly. London police are remarkably predictable when one provides them with sufficient incentive. Harland's eyes narrowed. You came prepared. Holmes said nothing. The scraping above intensified. Then, a sudden crash. A section of wooden panelling above us burst inward. Men dropped through the opening. Lestrade was among them. The inspector landed heavily, revolver drawn. Police! Nobody move! Chaos erupted instantly. Pell spun toward the back of the warehouse. Harland reached for something inside his coat. Holmes shouted sharply, Watson! Beaumont! I rushed forward, as Pell tried to seize the colonel's chair. A struggle broke out near the crates. Harland moved with sudden violent speed, striking a constable aside. Lestrade fired a shot into the ceiling. Stop! But Harland was already moving toward the rear exit. Holmes pursued him without hesitation. For a brief instant, I saw them both disappear into the shadowed depths between stacked crates. Then Harland's voice rang out, strangely calm, even amid chaos. You are too late, Mr. Holmes. Holmes' reply followed instantly. I rarely arrive on time. I prefer certainty. A crash, a scuffle, then silence. When I reached that part of the warehouse, Holmes stood alone near an open side door leading into the foggy riverside night. Harland was gone. Pell had been arrested. Beaumont was freed, trembling but alive. Lestrade was shouting orders in the background. But Holmes said nothing at all. He only stood in the doorway, staring into the drifting fog over the Thames. After a long moment, I approached him. He escaped. Holmes did not turn. No, he said quietly. I frowned. You saw him leave. I saw him choose direction. He stepped out into the fog, and I know precisely where that direction leads. His voice carried a strange certainty, one I had never heard from him before, and for the first time in my acquaintance with Sherlock Holmes, I felt not merely astonishment at his brilliance, but genuine concern for what he believed he now understood. Chapter 7. The man who walked into the fog. The Thames fog that night was unlike any I had seen in London even during the worst winters. It did not simply obscure, it absorbed. Gas lamps dissolved into dull copper halos, and the river itself became indistinguishable from the air above it, as though the city were suspended in a single vast grey lung. Holmes moved through it without hesitation. I followed close behind, while Lestrade and two constables trailed at a more cautious distance, their footsteps swallowed almost immediately by the mist. Holmes, I called. Where are you taking us? He did not turn. To where the truth stops pretending, he said. That is not an answer. It is the only useful kind. We reached the edge of the wharf where the warehouse structures thinned into derelict docks and half-classabbed timber piers. Somewhere ahead, The water lapped faintly against stone, though even that sound felt distorted, as though coming from beneath layers of wool. Lestrade caught up, breathless. "You said Harland escaped this way." Holmes stopped abruptly. "I said he chose this direction. And you know where he went?" "Yes." The inspector frowned. "Then why are we wandering blind through the fog?" Holmes turned slightly. "Because he is not running from us." A pause. "He is returning to something." I felt a faint unease at those words. "What could possibly be here?" I asked. Holmes pointed ahead into the mist. "History." We soon reached a cluster of abandoned storage sheds, leaning toward the river like exhausted men. One structure stood slightly apart from the rest. An old customs storehouse, its windows boarded, its door half torn from its hinges. Holmes approached it without hesitation. Inside, the air was colder. Not merely cold in temperature, but in feeling, as though the place had not been occupied in years, yet still remembered occupation. A faint chemical odour lingered beneath the damp timber scent. Holmes paused. "Watson," he murmured, "do you notice anything?" I inhaled carefully. "Medicinal, perhaps?" "No." He knelt briefly near the floorboards. "Grease paint." Lestrade made a noise of disgust. "This again?" Holmes rose. "Everything again, Lestrade. That is the nature of repetition." He moved deeper into the structure. We followed. At the far end stood an old partitioned room, its door ajar. Holmes pushed it open gently. The room inside was small, almost like a dressing chamber. A cracked mirror hung upon one wall. Beneath it lay a battered wooden table covered with scattered items: brushes, cloths, spirit containers, and small metal tins. Stage cosmetics. I felt a tightening in my chest. Lestrade muttered, "What kind of place is this?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He was staring at the mirror, or rather, at what remained on it. Across its surface were faint smears, fingerprints, layered impressions of powder and oil, as though multiple faces had been pressed close to it over time. Holmes spoke quietly. "This is where he learned." "Learned what?" I asked. Holmes turned slightly. "How to become someone else." A sudden sound came from outside, a slow clap, once. Then again. Holmes stiffened. From the doorway emerged Edgar Pell. He looked remarkably calm for a man recently arrested. Behind him, 2 constables lay unconscious near the threshold. Lestrade raised his revolver instantly. "Don't move," Pell smiled. "I wouldn't dream of it." Holmes did not appear surprised. "I thought you might return." Pell inclined his head slightly. "Of course I returned. This is where it all began." Holmes took a slow step forward, with Reginald Beaumont. Pell's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, so you have reached the correct layer." Lestrade snapped sharply. "Stop speaking in riddles." Pell glanced at him. "I assure you, Inspector, I am speaking quite plainly." Holmes remained focused. "Where is Harland?" Pell gestured vaguely toward the river. "Beyond that door, or within it, depending on your definition of he." I felt my irritation sharpen. "Enough of this nonsense." Pell smiled faintly. "You still believe there are 2 men?" Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Are there not?" Pell walked slowly toward the cracked mirror. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, when you observed Colonel Beaumont and Victor Harland side by side, what exactly did you see?" Holmes replied carefully. "I saw 2 physically distinct individuals." "Ah," Pell said softly, "but that is not what you now believe." Holmes said nothing. Pell continued. "You suspect duplication, imposture, disguise, the comfortable language of detection." He turned slightly. "But the truth is simpler." Lestrade barked. "I'll arrest you again if you don't stop talking and start explaining." Pell ignored him completely. Reginald Beaumont did not die in Rangoon. Holmes' voice was very quiet. "No," he returned, Pell said, "and fractured." I frowned. "Fractured?" Pell nodded. "Into what you now call Colonel Beaumont, and what others shaped into Harland." Lestrade scoffed loudly. "So your story is that 1 man became 2? Pell smiled. "Inspector, your objection is emotional, not logical." Holmes stepped closer. "Explain the mechanism." Pell gestured toward the table. "Chemistry, suggestion, conditioning, repetition." He tapped one of the cosmetic tins. "And performance." Holmes' gaze sharpened. You used Fern, of course. And Mowbray Mallory? Pell shrugged lightly. They became necessary corrections. Holmes' voice hardened. You killed them. I arranged outcomes, Pell corrected calmly. Others executed them. Lestrade raised his gun again. That's enough. But Holmes did not look at him. He was watching Pell with absolute focus. You are not denying involvement, Pell smiled. Denying is for people who fear truth. I am beyond that stage. Holmes spoke slowly. You are constructing identity through psychological dissociation. Pell's eyes brightened. Excellent. You finally speak my language. Holmes' tone sharpened. But you require a physical anchor. Yes, and Beaumont was that anchor. Pell nodded. A malleable vessel. A sudden sound came from behind us. A slow, deliberate movement. We turned. Colonel Beaumont stood in the doorway, free, unbound, but different. There was something altered in his posture. Less confusion, more stillness. As though some internal struggle had settled into resolution. Lestrade exclaimed. How did you? Beaumont raised a hand. No need. His voice was calm, too calm. Holmes stared at him. For the first time I saw uncertainty in his expression. Beaumont stepped forward into the room. Holmes, he said quietly. You have been looking at this incorrectly, Holmes replied slowly. Have I? Beaumont nodded. There are not two men. A pause. There never were. Lestrade looked between them sharply. What does that mean? Beaumont continued. I am not split. He raised his head slightly. I am assembled. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Pell seemed satisfied, as though a conclusion long anticipated had finally arrived. Holmes spoke very quietly. Then Harland? Beaumont's expression did not change. A mask. Holmes' voice hardened. And Reginald Beaumont? A faint pause. Beaumont looked toward the cracked mirror. Another mask. Lestrade muttered. This is madness. Beaumont turned slightly toward him. No, Inspector. It is design. Holmes took one step forward. And Edgar Pell? Beaumont answered calmly. The hand that adjusted the lighting. Pell bowed slightly. Flattering. Holmes' eyes narrowed dangerously. You are attempting to erase individuality entirely. Beaumont's voice softened. I am attempting to remove contradiction. Holmes replied instantly. By manufacturing murder. Beaumont did not deny it. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the broken window frames. Somewhere in the distance a bell sounded across the river. Distant, distorted, almost unreal. Holmes spoke again, slower now. Tell me where Harland is. Beaumont looked at him directly. He is where I am not. Holmes understood instantly. His expression changed, and I realized with sudden dread that whatever Holmes believed he had solved, he had just discovered he was still missing the central truth. Chapter 8. The mirror that did not reflect Holmes stood motionless for several seconds after Beaumont's last words. He is where I am not. The phrase lingered in the damp air of the abandoned customs storehouse, like a stain that refused to settle. Even Lestrade, usually quick to dismiss anything resembling abstraction, appeared momentarily uncertain. Holmes finally spoke. That is not an explanation. Beaumont regarded him with an unsettling calm. It is the only accurate one. Pell gave a quiet laugh. You see, Mr. Holmes, you are still insisting on physical geography. Left and right, one man here, another there. Holmes turned sharply toward him. Then define it properly. Pell gestured toward the cracked mirror on the wall. Identity is not located in the body. It is distributed. Lestrade muttered. I've heard enough philosophy for one night. Holmes ignored him completely. Distributed across what? Beaumont answered. Memory, behaviour, reinforcement. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Splitting does not produce coordination. Beaumont stepped closer to the mirror. Unless the split is guided. A long silence followed. Then Holmes spoke, very quietly. You are suggesting deliberate construction of separate operational identities within a single mind. Pell smiled faintly. Now you are approaching clarity. Holmes shook his head once. That level of sustained partition is medically implausible without catastrophic failure of continuity. Beaumont replied. It failed. Holmes' gaze sharpened. And Harland is the failure. A faint hesitation. Then Beaumont nodded. Yes. Lestrade raised his hands in frustration. This is absurd. We are standing in a warehouse arguing about whether a man is one person or two. Holmes spoke without looking at him. No, Lestrade, we are not arguing. He stepped forward slowly. We are watching a confession collapse under its own structure. Beaumont's calm expression tightened slightly. Holmes continued. You created Harland as a functional persona. Beaumont did not deny it, and you attempted to suppress him. Yes, by removing memory continuity. Yes, and by external reinforcement, letters, witnesses, staged crimes. Beaumont nodded again. Holmes' voice sharpened. And the murders. A pause. Beaumont answered simply. Necessary correction points. Lestrade snapped. You call 3 deaths corrections. Pell shrugged lightly. In any system, errors must be removed. Holmes turned slightly toward him. Who decides what is an error? Pell smiled. The system. Holmes exhaled slowly. That is not an answer. It is the only answer that matters. A sudden sound came from the far end of the warehouse, a faint, metallic scrape. All of us turned. The fog outside had thickened further, seeping through broken planks and curling along the floorboards like something alive. Holmes raised a hand slightly. Stay still, Lestrade whispered. What is it now? Holmes did not answer. The scrape came again, closer, then a soft footstep. From the fog at the far doorway, a figure emerged. At first I thought it was Beaumont again, but the posture was different. Straighter, sharper, less burdened. The man stepped fully into the lamplight, and I felt my breath catch. It was Colonel Beaumont, yet not the one standing beside Pell. This second Beaumont wore no rope marks, no exhaustion, no uncertainty. His gaze was steady, almost detached. Lestrade blurted, 2 of him! Holmes raised a hand sharply. Quiet. The 2 men now faced each other across the room. Beaumont beside us did not move. The newcomer spoke first. I see you have reached the conclusion. His voice was identical. Holmes stepped forward slowly. Which conclusion is that? The second Beaumont smiled faintly. That I am no longer required to explain myself. Pell murmured behind us. Excellent timing. Lestrade turned on him. Which one is real? Pell answered casually. Define real. Holmes ignored them. His attention was fixed entirely on the 2 men. Both of you are present in the same location. The first Beaumont spoke quietly. No, only one is present physically, the second added. And one is projected. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Explain. The second Beaumont gestured slightly toward the cracked mirror. You are still thinking in singular terms. Holmes replied sharply. Because singularity is what exists. A faint smile from the second Beaumont. Not always. The fog inside the warehouse shifted unnaturally, as if disturbed by their conversation. Holmes spoke again, slower now. You are claiming shared embodiment. Beaumont beside us finally spoke. We are claiming distribution. Holmes turned slightly toward him. And which of you committed the murders? A pause. Both men answered together. Neither, Lestrade shouted. That's ridiculous. Holmes raised a hand again. Explain. The second Beaumont replied. Action was delegated. To whom? A faint pause. Then, to necessity. Holmes' expression hardened. That is not a person. It becomes one, said the first Beaumont quietly, when repeated often enough. Silence followed. I felt a growing unease I could not articulate. Holmes spoke very carefully now. Then Harland is not a person. The second Beaumont nodded. Harland is function, and Pell? A faint smile. Administrator. Holmes turned slowly toward Pell. You have been orchestrating environmental triggers. Pell bowed slightly. I prefer the term facilitation. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And Colonel Beaumont. The first Beaumont answered. A vessel of constraint. Holmes stepped forward another pace. And Reginald. The second Beaumont replied softly. A vessel of action. Holmes suddenly stopped. For the first time I saw something shift in his expression. Not confusion, recognition, a deeper recognition. He spoke quietly. There is a missing component. Pell tilted his head. Is there? Holmes turned toward both Beaumonts. The system requires an observer. A pause. Then the second Beaumont smiled. Ah! Lestrade frowned. What is he talking about? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the cracked mirror again. And for a moment, I saw it too. Not a reflection, but an absence where reflection should have been. Holmes spoke softly. One of you is not present because one of you is perceiving. The warehouse fell utterly silent. Then the second Beaumont said, very calmly, Correct. Holmes' eyes sharpened. You are not two men. A pause. You are one system observing itself through divided outputs. Pell clapped slowly. Very good. Lestrade stared blankly. I don't understand a word of this. Holmes turned slightly. You will. The second Beaumont stepped forward. And now you see why you are dangerous. Holmes replied evenly. I see why you are unstable. A faint smile. Instability is only a problem when containment fails. Holmes' voice hardened. And containment has failed. The second Beaumont looked toward the fogged doorway behind us. Yes. A long pause. Then he added. And it is no longer necessary. At that instant Holmes moved. Not toward the men. Toward the doorway. Watson, Lestrade out! The shout came too late. The fog outside surged inward violently, as if drawn, and from within it, a sound. Not footsteps, not voices, but overlapping echoes of them. Multiple tones, multiple identities, converging. Holmes turned back once. His expression was no longer uncertainty. It was comprehension, complete and final. Then he said, very quietly, it was never two faces, a pause. It was never even one man. The fog swallowed the doorway, and everything went white. Chapter the 9. The fog that thinks. The white was not absence, it was presence without form. For several seconds I could neither see Holmes nor Lestrade nor the warehouse itself. Sound remained, but distorted. Footsteps without direction, breath without source, and something deeper beneath it all, like a low mental pressure, pressing inward from every side. Then gradually shapes returned. The warehouse reassembled itself out of mist. Lestrade was on one knee near the doorway, coughing violently. One constable lay sprawled against a crate. Pell stood motionless where he had been, as though the world had simply resumed around him. Beaumont, both Beaumonts, were gone. Holmes stood alone near the threshold, perfectly still. I rushed toward him. Holmes, what happened? He did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the fog outside, now thinning into restless strands drifting along the river wind. Lestrade staggered upright, furious and shaken. They escaped, all of them. Holmes spoke quietly. No. Lestrade blinked. What do you mean, no? Holmes finally turned. There was no escape. I felt a chill pass through me. Then where? He interrupted softly. They were never contained. A long silence followed. Pell gave a low, satisfied sigh. You are beginning to understand. Holmes ignored him. Instead, he walked slowly into the centre of the warehouse, where the cracked mirror still hung on the wall. It was now completely clean. No smears, no residue, no fingerprints. Lestrade frowned. That wasn't like that before. Holmes nodded. Yes, he raised a hand and touched the glass lightly. And now it is. I stepped closer. What has changed? Holmes replied without turning. Perception. Pell chuckled. Correct. Holmes' voice sharpened instantly. Stop congratulating yourself. Pell smiled faintly. I am not congratulating myself. I am observing completion, Lestrade snapped. Completion of what? Holmes turned slowly toward us. A closed system, he said. I frowned. That means nothing. Holmes' gaze was distant. It means, he said carefully, that what we believe to be identity was actually a controlled partition of behaviour patterns distributed across multiple actors. Lestrade muttered. So you're saying there were two Beaumonts? Holmes shook his head. No. He stepped closer to the mirror. There was one process expressed through multiple points of execution. I struggled to follow. Then Harland, Pell, the Colonel. All roles, Holmes said quietly. Roles played by whom? Holmes hesitated for the first time, then said, That is the question I have not yet answered. A silence fell. Outside the fog shifted again, but more slowly now, like something losing interest. Pell spoke softly. You are very close, Mr. Holmes. Holmes turned sharply. Close to what? Pell smiled. To the observer, Lestrade scoffed. This is ridiculous. Observer of what? Holmes answered before Pell could. Of the system itself. I felt my mind tighten around the idea, trying to resist it. Holmes continued slowly. The letters, the staged murders, the shifting identities, the duplicate appearances. None of them were independent events. He looked at Pell. They were feedback signals. Pell inclined his head. Correct. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And Colonel Beaumont? Pell answered simply. The interface. Holmes' voice dropped. And Reginald? A faint pause. Pell replied, The executor. Lestrade looked between them, confused and angry. This is all nonsense. You are inventing categories to explain madness. Holmes did not look at him. No, he said quietly. I am removing categories that no longer apply. A sudden distant sound came from outside. Not footsteps, not voices. A pattern, repeating irregularly. Holmes stiffened. Pell listened too, his expression softening. It is stabilizing, he said. Holmes turned sharply. No. He moved quickly toward the door. I followed instinctively. What is stabilizing? Holmes answered without slowing. The system is resynchronizing. Lestrade hurried behind us. Synchronized with what? Holmes stepped out into the fog again. The river was barely visible now, but the sound was clearer. The repeating pattern was not random. It was rhythmic, like speech, but not spoken by a single throat. Holmes stopped. Watson, he said quietly. Do you hear it? I listened. At first only wind, then fragments, overlapping phrases, half-formed sentences, multiple tones layered together. Lestrade looked unsettled. What is that supposed to be? Holmes replied. A conversation. I frowned. Between who? Holmes' expression darkened. Between states. A sudden movement in the fog ahead. A figure emerged. Then another. Then several more. Not running, not walking, just appearing. All resembling Colonel Beaumont. Yet none identical. Some with Harlan's sharper features. Some with Beaumont's worn exhaustion. Some blending both. Lestrade stepped back. What in God's name? Holmes raised a hand sharply. Do not engage them. The figures stopped at a distance, then spoke. Not one voice, but many, layered, overlapping. System integrity approaching threshold, observer detected, external cognitive resistance present. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. So it is true. One of the figures stepped forward slightly. Its voice was calm, almost familiar. You are the anomaly, Mr. Holmes, Holmes replied immediately. No. A pause. I am the interruption. Silence followed. Then the figure spoke again. You were not part of the design. Holmes nodded once. Correct. A faint shift in the fog around us. Lestrade whispered. Holmes, what is happening? Holmes did not look at him. Instead, he said softly, You are not looking at men. He gestured toward the figures. You are looking at a constructed cognition distributed across bodies. Lestrade looked horrified. That's impossible, Holmes answered. Yet it is functioning. A pause. Then Holmes added quietly, And it is learning. The figures in the fog moved slightly closer. The overlapping voices intensified. Holmes stepped forward. I want to speak to the origin. A silence. Then one figure tilted its head. There is no origin. Holmes' eyes narrowed. There is always an origin. A longer pause. Then one voice emerged more clearly than the rest. Not layered, not fractured, single, calm, familiar. Then speak to me. Holmes froze. So did I, because that voice was his own. Chapter X. The voice that answered Holmes. The fog did not move. It waited. The single voice. Holmes' own voice. Hung in the air with an intimacy that was profoundly wrong, as though the world had briefly learned to imitate thought itself. Holmes stood perfectly still. Lestrade, beside me, whispered hoarsely. That's his voice, I could not deny it. The cadence, the precision, even the faint underlying restraint. It was unmistakably Sherlock Holmes speaking from within the mist. Yet Holmes himself remained motionless. He stared at the figures ahead. Then he spoke quietly. That is not me. The voice in the fog replied at once. Correction. It is you. A ripple passed through the clustered figures. Some stepped closer, others faded slightly, as though reacting to a central command. Holmes's expression hardened. You are a mimic structure. the voice answered calmly. All cognition is mimicry refined through repetition. Holmes shook his head once. No, cognition requires continuity. A pause. Then the voice responded. Continuity is a narrative constraint, Lestrade muttered. I don't understand any of this. Holmes did not look away from the fog. You are not a man, he said. I am function expressed through distributed embodiment. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Who initiated the distribution? A pause, then. No single agent. Holmes stepped forward. That is impossible. The voice replied evenly. It is already completed. A strange sensation passed through the air, like pressure shifting inside the mind rather than the body. The fog seemed to tighten around the shoreline, drawing inward toward the figures. One of them, bearing a faint resemblance to Harland, spoke abruptly. Observer influence increasing. Another added, stabilization required. Lestrade raised his revolver again. Holmes, tell me what to shoot. Holmes did not answer. His attention was entirely fixed on the central voice. Explain the murders, he said quietly. The voice replied immediately. Error, correction events. Holmes' tone sharpened. They were human beings, designation irrelevant. Holmes took another step forward. That is not how humans operate. A pause. Then the voice answered. That is how systems persist. Silence fell again. Even the fog seemed to pause. Then Holmes spoke in a lower, more deliberate tone. You are attempting to eliminate contradiction by eliminating individuality. Yes. And Beaumont resisted. Yes, so you fractured him. A brief pause. Then. He was pre-fractured. Holmes' eyes narrowed. What does that mean? The voice replied. He contained incompatible operational states prior to intervention. Holmes' expression tightened. Then Reginald Beaumont was not separate from him. Correct. Holmes exhaled slowly. You did not create a double. No, you revealed one. A pause. Then the voice said, Correct. Lestrade burst out. This is insane. You're telling me a man becomes two people and that's normal now? Holmes raised a hand slightly. Be silent. Lestrade stopped, stunned by the tone. Holmes continued. Then Pell's role, the voice answered. Interface A stabilizer. And Harland? Execution channel. Holmes nodded slowly. And Colonel Beaumont? A pause, then. Constraint node. Holmes' jaw tightened. And the murders? The voice answered without hesitation. Interference removal. Holmes' voice sharpened. They were preventing exposure. Correct. A long silence followed. Then Holmes spoke more quietly. And Miss Valewood? A pause. External anchor variable. Holmes' expression changed slightly. You intended to use her? No, a slight hesitation. To stabilize constraint. Holmes stepped forward sharply. By emotional binding. Yes, Lestrade muttered. You're talking about people like machines. Holmes did not respond. His gaze remained fixed on the fog. Then he said softly, You are incomplete. A pause. The voice responded, Explain. Holmes gestured faintly toward the figures. You are operating on a closed loop. Self-referential reinforcement, without external correction, leads to collapse. A pause. Then correction not required. Holmes shook his head once. It already is. For the first time, something in the fog shifted. Not visually, conceptually. The layered figures wavered slightly. Lestrade noticed. What's happening? Holmes' eyes narrowed. You are destabilizing. The voice responded immediately. Observer interference detected. Holmes took another step forward. I am not interference. A pause. Then Holmes said, very quietly, I am the constraint you failed to anticipate. The fog tightened. The figures blurred. Then the central voice spoke again, but less stable now. Define constraint. Holmes answered instantly. Unpredictability. A long silence. Then, for the first time, the voice did not respond immediately. Lestrade looked around nervously. What now? Holmes remained still. Then he said softly, You are not used to being questioned. A faint distortion passed through the fog. Then the voice returned, less uniform than before. Questioning increases instability. Holmes nodded once, yes. A pause. Good. Lestrade stared at him. Good? Holmes finally glanced back at us. Yes, Lestrade. Good. Then he turned again toward the fog. Because instability is how systems fail. The fog shifted violently. The figures began to lose coherence. Some flickered, some dissolved. The layered voices fractured. Then a final statement emerged, weaker now, but still coherent. "Observer cannot be integrated." Holmes replied calmly, "I was never meant to be." A pause. Then Holmes added, "I was meant to conclude you." For the first time, silence fell completely. No fog voices, no overlapping echoes, just whined over the Thames. Lestrade whispered, "What does that mean?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he took one step forward into the thinning mist, and I realized with sudden, unsettling clarity. Whatever this system was, whatever these fractured identities had been, it was now collapsing around a single point of logic, and that point was Sherlock Holmes himself. Chapter 11. The point where logic breaks. The fog did not disperse so much as forget itself. That is the only way I can describe what followed. One moment the riverbank was crowded with shifting silhouettes and fractured voices. The next, those same shapes began to lose definition, as though their certainty had been withdrawn rather than destroyed. Edges softened, boundaries blurred, even sound seemed uncertain of where to land. Lestrade stood beside me, revolver lowered, now his expression caught between relief and confusion. "This is over?" he asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. He remained a few paces ahead of us, facing the emptying mist. Then he said, "No." The single word carried an unpleasant finality. I stepped forward. "Holmes, the figures are gone." "Yes," he replied. "Then what remains?" Holmes turned slightly. "The structure," I frowned. "What structure?" He looked back toward the river. "Meaning persists after representation collapses." Lestrade muttered, "That sounds like more of your philosophy." Holmes replied without looking at him. "It is not philosophy. It is residue." A faint wind moved across the water. No voices returned, no shapes reformed. Yet Holmes did not relax. Instead, his posture had subtly changed. Less investigative now, more anticipatory. As though waiting for something that had not yet acknowledged its own arrival. Then, very quietly, he spoke. "You are still here." There was no visible response. Lestrade frowned. "To whom are you speaking?" Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Not to individuals." A pause. "To what remains when individuals are no longer sufficient?" I felt a chill pass through me. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you said the system was collapsing." "Yes." "And it has." Holmes nodded once. "Partially." Lestrade shook his head. "This is absurd. There is no system left. The warehouse is empty, the men are gone, and whatever that fog nonsense was," Holmes interrupted softly, "you are assuming disappearance equals resolution." Lestrade hesitated. What else could it mean? Holmes turned fully toward us. "That the structure has shifted location." I stared at him. "You mean physically?" "No." "Then what?" Holmes hesitated for the first time in hours. Then he said, "Cognitively." A long silence followed. Even Lestrade did not speak. From somewhere along the river, a bell rang faintly, distant, distorted, as though heard through layers of water. Holmes's gaze tightened. "It is no longer distributed externally," he said quietly. "Then where is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me directly, and for the first time since this affair began, I felt as though he was not speaking as an observer of events, but as something within them. Then he said, "It is attempting integration." Lestrade blinked. "What does that mean?" Holmes replied. "It means it no longer requires separate actors." A cold silence followed. Then I understood, and the understanding was deeply unwelcome. "You mean," I began slowly, "it is becoming unified?" Holmes nodded once. "Yes," Lestrade scoffed nervously. "That's ridiculous. You can't unify something that isn't." He stopped. Because Holmes was looking at him now. Not at the river, not at the fog, at us. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "What?" Holmes spoke quietly. "You have both been observing fragmentation as external." I frowned. "And you have not?" Holmes' expression darkened slightly. "I have been observing convergence." A pause. Lestrade frowned. "Convergence of what?" Holmes answered simply. "Of inference." A silence followed that felt heavier than fog. Then Holmes turned back toward the river. and said something I did not immediately understand. "At some point," he murmured, "the system does not require bodies." Lestrade took a step backward. "Holmes, what are you saying?" Holmes did not respond at once. Instead, he removed something from his coat pocket, the grey theatrical sponge, the same one from Bow Street. He held it up between finger and thumb, then spoke softly. "This was never evidence." I stared at him. "Then, what was it?" Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A trigger." Lestrade stepped forward angrily. "For what?" Holmes looked at him directly. "For recognition." A pause. Then Holmes added, "And recognition has now occurred." The wind over the Thames shifted suddenly. Not stronger, more focused. Lestrade raised his revolver again instinctively. "What are you talking about?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he said quietly, "Watson, yes. Do you recall the first moment Colonel Beaumont described his missing hours?" I hesitated. "Yes." Holmes nodded. "And do you recall what I said upon first seeing him?" I frowned, thinking back. "You said he was a man, fearing he might be losing his reason." Holmes nodded again. "Yes." A pause. Then he said, "I was incorrect," Lestrade barked. "About what?" Holmes turned slightly toward us. He was not losing his reason, a beat. He was sharing it. The silence that followed felt absolute. Then Holmes spoke one final time, very softly. "And now it is complete." The fog over the river did not rise. It did not fall. It simply became still. And in that stillness, I realized something that chilled me more than any mystery I had ever witnessed beside Sherlock Holmes. Not that something had escaped. Not that something had died. But that something had finished assembling itself, using Holmes' own deductions as the final missing piece. Chapter 12. The Final Deduction. For a moment after Holmes spoke, no one moved. Even Lestrade, usually quick to break silence with disbelief or protest, stood rigid beside me, his revolver lowered but still in hand, as though uncertain whether the enemy was fog, man, or idea. The Thames lay motionless beyond the wharf, its surface black and unreadable. Holmes remained facing it. Then I spoke carefully. "Holmes, what do you mean complete?" He did not answer at once. When he finally turned, there was something in his expression I had never seen before. Not fear exactly. Not triumph. Something more precise and more unsettling. Clarity without comfort. "You have been assuming," he said quietly, "that I have been solving a case." Lestrade frowned. "Of course you have." Holmes shook his head once. "No." A pause. "I have been participating in it." That sentence struck me oddly. But before I could respond, he continued, "Every deduction I made was correct. That is the danger." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "That makes no sense at all." Holmes' gaze sharpened slightly. "It makes perfect sense if the deductions themselves are part of the mechanism being studied." I stepped forward. "You mean you were being guided?" Holmes did not deny it. "Influenced." Lestrade's voice rose. "By what? Those men? That nonsense about systems and voices in fog?" Holmes turned slowly toward him. "Yes." A silence followed. Then Holmes added, "And by something far more dangerous." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. What could be more dangerous than that? Holmes looked at me directly. "Certainty." The wind shifted over the river again, but softer now, almost respectful. Holmes continued, "When Colonel Beaumont first arrived, I believed I was observing a fractured identity." He paused. "That was correct," Lestrade muttered. "Then what's the problem?" Holmes ignored him. "But I also assumed the fracture was unstable." A slight pause. "That was incorrect." I frowned. "How so?" Holmes turned back toward the river. "Because instability implies decay." He lowered his voice. "This was not decaying." A pause. "It was refining." Lestrade frowned. "Refining what?" Holmes answered quietly. "A method of thought distributed across multiple human carriers." The words hung in the air. I felt my mind resist them instinctively. Holmes continued. "Beaumont was not an exception. He was an entry point." A pause. Pell maintained structure. Harland executed adaptation. And others, Mowbray, Mallory Fern, functioned as correctional tests. Lestrade shook his head violently. "This is absurd. You're describing people like components in a machine." Holmes nodded once. "Yes." A silence followed. Then I asked quietly, "And what was the machine for?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower. "To determine whether a single coherent observer could be induced into self-distribution," I frowned. "I don't understand." Holmes turned toward me. "You were not meant to understand it immediately." A pause. "Only eventually." Lestrade stepped forward sharply. "Holmes, listen to yourself. You're implying this system, wanted to study you." Holmes did not answer. That silence was answer enough. Lestrade's face tightened. "That's insane." Holmes finally replied, "No, Lestrade, a beat. That is architecture." The river gave no sound. Even the fog seemed to hold its breath. Then Holmes said something very softly, "And I have now completed the required demonstration." I felt my stomach tighten. "What demonstration?" Holmes turned slightly toward us. "That a sufficiently analytical mind will reconstruct its own observer model when provided with structured ambiguity." A pause. "In other words," he hesitated, "I have finished the system's reasoning for it." Lestrade stared at him. "You're saying you helped it understand itself?" Holmes nodded once. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then I whispered, "Holmes, can it still be stopped?" For the first time he did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted back toward the river. Then he said quietly, "That depends on whether it was ever external to begin with." Lestrade snapped, "Of course it was external. We saw it." Holmes shook his head. "No." A pause. "We saw its outputs." A faint wind moved over the water again, but now it felt different, less like weather, more like attention shifting. Holmes stepped forward to the edge of the wharf. Then he spoke one final time, very calmly. "If you are listening," he said, "you have made an error." No response came. Holmes continued, "You assumed deduction is the same as understanding." A pause. "It is not." Lestrade looked at him, alarm rising. "Holmes, who are you talking to?" Holmes did not look back. "Something that believes it has concluded me." A silence. Then Holmes added, "But deduction does not conclude observers." A pause. "It only reveals them." The fog over the Thames did not move. And then, very faintly, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, not in the air, not in the fog, but inside the act of listening itself. Not Holmes, not Beaumont, not Pell, something else. And it said only this: "Observation accepted." Holmes closed his eyes. Lestrade raised his revolver instinctively. I stepped back without realizing why, and Sherlock Holmes, spoke his final words on the matter very quietly. "Then I am no longer the observer." A pause. "I am the observed." The fog did not answer. But it changed, and that was the end of the case of the man with two faces. Epilogue. Baker Street. After the fog, I have often been asked since that night whether the events at Blackthorn Wharf were the product of exhaustion, imagination, or some shared delusion induced by the oppressive London fog. I can only state what I know. Inspector Lestrade, upon returning to Bow Street, found no trace of Edgar Pell in custody. The constables, who had accompanied us, could not agree on whether they had ever truly seen Colonel Beaumont bound in the warehouse. Official reports, as always, reduced the affair to escaped prisoner and associated disturbances. The Thames resumed its ordinary indifference within days. London, too, forgot, but Sherlock Holmes did not. We returned to Baker Street in the early hours of the morning. He walked ahead of me in silence, his coat still damp from river mist. Once inside, he did not light his pipe. He did not sit. He did not open his notebooks. Instead, he stood at the window for a long time, watching the street below as though expecting it to answer him. At last I spoke. "Holmes, whatever you believe happened, you must rest." He did not turn. "I am not tired," he said. A pause. "I am accounted for." I frowned. That is not a normal expression. "No," he agreed quietly. "It is not." A long silence followed. Then I asked the question I had avoided since the warehouse. "Do you believe it is finished?" Only then did he turn. His face was composed again, carefully so, as though reassembled by will rather than certainty. "I believe," he said slowly, "that it has changed form." "Changed form?" Holmes nodded once. "An external system requires boundaries. It has lost those." I felt a chill. Then, where is it now? Holmes looked at me for a long moment before answering. Where it was always heading. And where is that? He glanced briefly toward the window. Anywhere reasoning occurs without awareness of its origin. A silence followed. Then, very softly, he added, "That includes here." I did not reply. What reply could there be? Outside, London moved on as it always does. Unaware, unbothered, uncorrected. A cab rattled somewhere in the distance. A newspaper boy shouted an irrelevant headline. Life, indifferent to meaning, continued its steady performance. Holmes finally crossed to his chair and sat down, not in exhaustion, in resolution. For the first time since I had known him, he did not reach for his violin, nor for tobacco, nor for any distraction of mind or hand. Instead, he placed his fingertips together and looked at nothing in particular. After some minutes, I spoke again. "Holmes, if this case has taught us anything, what is it?" He considered this for a long time. Then he said quietly, "That certainty is not proof of truth." A pause, and that observation may not belong to the observer. I waited for more, but he said nothing further, and so ends the record of Sherlock Holmes and the man with two faces. Or rather, the case that suggested there may never have been two faces at all, only one mind. And something that learned how to look back. Next final note. The margin where the story stops, I hesitated for some time before adding this final note to my record. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the meaning of them resists the comfortable boundaries of explanation. In the weeks that followed the Blackthorn Wharf incident, Sherlock Holmes resumed certain of his customary habits. Chemical experiments, irregular violin playing, abrupt silences lasting hours. Yet something subtle had altered in his manner of attention. It was as though he no longer regarded the world as a collection of problems to be solved, but as a structure that might occasionally respond. Once, I found him standing before the mantelpiece, staring at nothing in particular. "Holmes," I asked, "what are you thinking about?" He replied without turning, "I am considering whether deduction is still a private act." I asked him what he meant. He said only, "That depends on whether it still has an audience." When I pressed him further, he smiled faintly and returned to his violin, refusing to elaborate. Inspector Lestrade, for his part, ceased speaking of the affair altogether. Official files were sealed, and references to Colonel Beaumont, Edgar Pell, and Victor Harland were quietly dispersed into administrative obscurity. The Hesperus Club denied any irregularity. London moved on, as it always does, by forgetting precisely those things it cannot comfortably categorize. Yet I sometimes recall a detail from that final night. Holmes, standing at the edge of the Thames, speaking into the fog, not as though addressing men, but as though addressing the act of being understood itself. At the time I believed it was a final deduction. I am no longer certain that is the correct word, for deduction implies an ending, and I have begun to suspect that some forms of reasoning do not end at all. They propagate, and occasionally, if one is unfortunate enough, or perceptive enough, to follow them far enough into the dark, one discovers something unsettling. Not that Holmes solved the case, but that the case learned how Holmes solved things, and adapted accordingly. If that thought seems unreasonable, I do not ask you to accept it. I only ask that you consider, in some quiet moment, whether every act of understanding truly belongs to the one who performs it, and if not, what else might be observing the process?